By the summer of 1945, a group of wounded German child soldiers found themselves recovering inside an American prisoner of war camp, far from the battlefields they had come from. Most of them carried injuries that hadn't fully healed yet. Some walked with bandages wrapped around their arms or shoulders. Others limped with stiff, uneven steps, and a few had scars that pulled tightly when they moved. The camp's small infirmary had become their routine, a place where medics wrapped wounds, changed dressings, and checked for infections with careful hands. Even with the medical attention, the boys lived with the same fear that hovered over most young prisoners, the thought that the Americans might eventually tire of caring for the wounded and decide to proceed with punishment. Rumors spread easily among the boys. They whispered about secret orders, about sudden discipline, about things that might happen once they were healed enough to stand. None of the rumors had proof, but fear fed on uncertainty. For boys who had seen harsh treatment in the last months of the war, it didn't take much imagination to picture the worst. The heat inside the camp didn't help. The summer sun pressed down heavily on the wooden roofs and sandy paths, baking the air and leaving everyone sweating by mid-morning. But before we continue, if you want to hear more incredible and untold stories from history, make sure to like the video and hit the subscribe button, and tell me in the comments what country you're watching from, and share any stories you or your relatives have from World War II. I would love to read them as well. Alright. The boys spent most of their time sitting in the shade behind the barracks, avoiding the sun as they nursed their injuries. They watched guards move calmly through their routines, never shouting, never threatening, but the boys didn't fully trust the calm. They kept waiting for the moment when the situation would turn. Then one afternoon, when the air seemed almost thick from heat, a guard approached their group and told them to line up. The order was delivered in the same flat, practical tone as usual, but the boys felt a jolt of panic. Sudden orders meant change, and change usually meant trouble. They struggled to their feet, forming a crooked line along the fence, some leaning on each other for balance. No explanation was given. The guards simply waited until the boys were ready. A few of the wounded boys exchanged quiet, anxious looks. The thought they had been trying to avoid for weeks pushed back into their minds. Maybe this was the time. Maybe they were being taken somewhere away from the rest of the prisoners, somewhere quiet and out of sight. The camp was organized and predictable, and anything that broke the routine felt dangerous. When a truck rolled into the yard and stopped near their group, the boys' fear deepened. The back gate of the truck dropped open with a heavy clang, echoing across the yard. The boys had heard that sound during prisoner transfers, and none of them liked what it signaled. Some of them stiffened instinctively, bracing themselves. The guards gave no clues, only motion for them to climb aboard. A few hesitated, but in the end, they all stepped toward the truck. Whatever waited, they didn't want to give the guards a reason to push or shout. They took their places on the wooden benches inside the vehicle, adjusting themselves carefully so their wounds didn't pull or ache. The guards climbed in behind them, expressionless as always, but that didn't calm the boys. Nothing about the moment felt ordinary. The truck rolled forward, leaving the familiar fence behind. The truck bounced along the road, its frame rattling with each dip in the pavement. The boys held onto the bench or to the side rails, doing their best to steady themselves despite their injuries. Some stared at the floorboards, others looked out through the open slats, watching the scenery blur past in the heat. Fields, small houses, and stretches of dusty road rolled by, all of it bright under the harsh sun. The boys' minds raced. None of them spoke the thought aloud, but they all felt it. This could be the end. They had grown up hearing that enemy nations would show no mercy toward captured fighters, especially the youngest ones who had been pulled into the conflict late in the war. Even after weeks of receiving medical care and regular meals, that idea had been hard to shake. Every quiet moment felt like a setup for something unseen. One boy in the group, his arm still bandaged from a wound near his elbow, sat stiffly with his jaw clenched tight. He had convinced himself for days that the Americans were simply waiting for them to heal enough to stand, so the execution would be tidy and organized. Another boy, limping slightly from a leg wound, kept replaying rumors he had heard from older prisoners, rumors that had taken on more weight now that they were on a truck, heading to an unknown location. The guards gave no indication of what was coming. They stood steady in the back of the truck, rifles slung casually, eyes scanning the road ahead. Their relaxed posture didn't reassure the boys. If anything, it made the situation more confusing. They expected to see more tension, more edge, more signs of something serious. Instead, everything felt oddly calm, which only made the boys' nerves climb higher. After a while, the truck slowed and turned. The boys braced themselves again. expecting to see a clearing, a building, or something foreboding. Instead, the truck rolled into a shaded area near a cluster of trees not far from a small town. Birds chirped overhead, and the wind rustled the leaves lightly. Nothing about the spot looked like a place where the worst would happen. But the boys didn't relax, not yet. The guards motioned for them to climb down. They stepped carefully onto the ground, uncertain and uneasy, unsure what they were supposed to be seeing. The group stood in a tight cluster, breathing shallowly, as they waited for an explanation. Instead, what they got was something entirely different. A second vehicle pulled up from the opposite direction. It wasn't a military truck. It was a civilian delivery van, its sides painted with bright lettering. The boys couldn't fully translate, but recognized enough to understand. The pictures on the side showed tall cones and bowls overflowing with something white and cold-looking. The boys stared, confused. The guards didn't say anything. They simply waited. The driver stepped out, walked to the back of the van, and opened the doors. Inside were containers packed with ice and filled to the brim with different flavors of ice cream. The cold air spilled outward in a cloud as the warm summer air hit it. The boys blinked in disbelief. They didn't understand what they were looking at. Ice cream wasn't something they had seen in a long time, certainly not since the shortages and chaos of the final months of the war. One of the guards finally spoke, not as an order, but as a simple statement. He told the boys to come forward and take a portion. The boys hesitated, frozen with confusion. They had prepared for punishment, possibly execution. Not this, not bowls of ice cream handed out in the middle of a hot day. When none of the boys moved, the guard repeated the instruction, this time with a brief gesture toward the van. Slowly, one stepped forward, moving cautiously as though expecting the situation to shift into something else. The driver handed him a small cup filled with chilled ice cream. A spoon stuck in the top. The boy held it carefully, staring at it like it might vanish. The others stepped forward one by one. Each received their own serving. The boys stood in a loose circle under the shade, holding the cold cups in their hands, still too stunned to eat at first. The guards watched from a few steps away, not impatient, just waiting. Finally, one of the boys dipped his spoon into the ice cream and took a small bite. His eyes widened immediately at the cold sweetness. That was all it took. The others followed, taking careful bites at first, then more eagerly as they realized it was real. The cold treat soothed their nerves, cutting through the oppressive heat and settling something inside them that had been tense for weeks. The boys didn't talk much, but they didn't need to. The relief on their faces said enough. The moment didn't erase their fear entirely, but it softened it in a way nothing else could have. The Americans weren't preparing them for execution. They weren't punishing them. They had brought them out simply to give them something normal, something comforting, something undeniably human. And that realization struck harder than any threat ever had. When the last spoonfuls were finished, the boys handed back their empty cups. The driver closed the van and gave a brief nod before heading off. The guard signaled for the boys to climb back into the truck. But now the mood had shifted. The boys moved with less tension, less dread. They still limped, still winced from their wounds. But their faces looked different. Some even exchanged small, uncertain smiles. The truck ride back to the camp felt less heavy. The boys watched the passing scenery again, but this time with clearer eyes. They didn't understand why the Americans had gone out of their way to bring them ice cream, yet the act was simple enough to speak for itself. It didn't fit the image they carried of what an enemy was supposed to be. It didn't match the warnings drilled into them during their training. And it didn't leave room for the grim assumptions they had lived with since the moment they surrendered. When they returned to the camp and climbed off the truck, other prisoners noticed the change immediately. They saw the calmer expressions, the softened nerves, and they asked questions. The boys did their best to explain, though even they struggled to find the right words. It sounded unbelievable, even as they described it. The idea of wounded enemy youths being taken outside the camp and given ice cream didn't fit any picture of war they had known. That night, as they lay on their bunks with the warm air drifting through the open windows, the boys replayed the afternoon in their minds. The cold taste, the shade under the trees, the guards standing quietly, offering no judgment. The moment didn't take away their injuries or their captivity. It didn't erase what they had lost, but it gave them something they hadn't expected to feel again. A sense of being treated like human beings instead of threats. And that memory stayed with them, long after the summer heat faded. By the next morning, the story of the ice cream outing had already begun moving through the camp. The boys hadn't meant to spread it, but the older prisoners could read expressions better than any guard could. They noticed the way the younger group carried themselves, the way tension had eased off their shoulders, and the way they seemed less braced for the worst. That alone was enough to spark curiosity. When questions came, the boys answered simply, describing what had happened in the same straightforward terms they had used with each other. Many of the adult prisoners reacted with disbelief. They struggled to imagine a situation in which the Americans would gather a group of wounded child soldiers, load them into a truck, and treat them to something as ordinary as ice cream. Some shook their heads as though the boys were mistaken, suggesting it must have been part of some larger strategy. Others asked for details, pressing the boys to explain again where the van had come from, who provided the treat, and why there had been no speeches or explanations. The boys didn't have answers. They could only repeat what they saw. As the morning passed, speculation circulated among the adults. A few believed the Americans were trying to soften the boys for questioning later, though nothing in the boys' story supported that idea. Others thought it might be part of a psychological effort to counteract the propaganda the boys had grown up with. Some simply shrugged and said the guards probably had more freedom to act kindly than anyone expected. The theories varied, but none could fully explain the plain truth that the boys had been given a simple moment of comfort without any conditions or hidden purpose. Meanwhile, the boys went back to their usual routines. They limped to the infirmary for wound checks, helped with light cleaning duties, and rested in the shade when the heat grew too strong. But even in the familiar routines, something felt different now. Fear didn't press on them as sharply. The memory of the cold ice cream, the quiet afternoon air, and the relaxed behavior of the guards had created a small buffer between them and the worst assumptions they used to live with. A few boys even caught themselves feeling almost normal for short stretches. It surprised them. For months, a constant sense of danger had followed them everywhere, shaping their thoughts and reactions. Now the idea that the Americans might see them as kids rather than criminals unsettled them in a gentler way. It wasn't easy to accept. They had been raised to think in simple categories: enemy or ally, threat or target. What they experienced didn't fit into those categories at all. Later in the day, one of the boys sat outside the barracks and watched a group of American soldiers walking along the fence. They were laughing about something he couldn't understand, relaxed in a way that didn't match his expectations of a wartime guard force. He didn't know if they had been involved in yesterday's outing, but he felt no hostility toward them. Instead, he felt curiosity. It was the first time he caught himself wondering what kind of lives these men had outside the uniform, and the thought surprised him. Back inside the barracks, the boys continued to talk about the outing in small, quiet clusters. Some spoke about the taste of the ice cream, how cold it felt against their tongues after so many months without anything like it. Others described the moment they realized the outing wasn't a trap. They mentioned how the guards had stood nearby without shouting orders or giving warnings, just calmly overseeing the moment like it was nothing out of the ordinary. These small details stuck with the boys more than anything else. They were reminders that not every experience in captivity had to be shaped by fear. As evening settled over the camp and the heat finally began to fade, the boys lay on their bunks with the windows open, letting the warm breeze drift in. They replayed the images of the day in their minds again and again, partly because they didn't want to forget, and partly because they still couldn't fully believe it had happened. The outing didn't undo the hardships they had faced, and it didn't erase the wounds they still carried, but it changed how they viewed the world outside the camp's fences. And for boys who had expected to die that morning, that change meant more than they could express. In the days that followed, the boys noticed small changes in the way they interpreted life inside the camp. Nothing around them had changed physically. The fences were the same, the towers were the same, and the guard rotations followed the same predictable pattern. But something in their minds had loosened. The constant expectation of cruelty didn't sit as heavily on their shoulders. They still followed orders with caution, still moved carefully to avoid misunderstandings, but they no longer jumped at every sudden noise or looked over their shoulders with the same sharp tension. Their wounds continued to heal slowly, some better than others. The medics checked their bandages regularly, speaking in calm, matter-of-fact tones as they inspected cuts and stitches. The boys still didn't understand every word, but they understood the tone, and that was enough to know they weren't in danger. The medics didn't handle them roughly. They didn't treat them like nuisances. They treated them like young patients recovering from injuries, which was exactly what they were, even if the boys weren't used to being seen that way. During free moments, the boys sat under the shade behind the barracks, talking quietly as they watched the rest of the camp go about its business. The adults, sometimes passed by and gave them brief nods, no longer treating them as fragile bundles of fear. Some of the adults even looked thoughtful when they saw the boys sitting more calmly. The story of the ice cream had softened more than just the boys' nerves. It had begun to affect how others in the camp interpreted their captors' intentions. A few boys admitted to each other that the outing had made them rethink things they had believed about America for years. They had been told that the enemy despised German youth, that surrender meant humiliation at best and execution at worst. Yet the Americans had taken them for ice cream without asking for anything in return. No warnings, no lectures, and no hidden meaning. Just a moment of relief from the heat, offered without cruelty. That simple act made some of the boys question what else they might have been wrong about. Others weren't ready to accept a new perspective so quickly. They held on to the idea that the outing was an exception, something organized by a few guards acting on their own. They told themselves not to trust it too deeply. They didn't want to be caught off guard if things turned harsh again. But even those boys couldn't deny how the outing had changed the atmosphere inside the group. Fear didn't sit as heavily on them anymore, even if they tried to ignore that fact. One afternoon, while the boys were resting near the barracks, a guard walked by carrying a bright red drink in a bottle. He paused briefly, glanced at the boys, and raised the bottle slightly in a casual gesture before continuing on his way. It wasn't a significant moment, but the boys noticed. They watched him go, surprised by the simple, friendly gesture. It wasn't something a guard would normally do to maintain control. It was the sort of thing someone did to show they didn't see children as threats. Moments like that added up slowly, creating a more complete picture. The boys began to understand that the Americans didn't hate them. They didn't seem interested in punishing them for being young soldiers. Instead, they acted as though the boys were victims of the war, swept up in something far bigger than themselves. That realization hit some of the boys harder than they expected. For so long, they had been told that loyalty required constant readiness to fight and constant suspicion of the enemy. Now they were faced with guards who treated them with consistent, steady humanity. At night, when the camp quieted and the summer air cooled slightly, the boys lay on their bunks replaying the ice cream outing in their minds. The memory remained clear and comforting. They could still feel the coldness of the cup in their hands, still taste the sweetness that was so unfamiliar after years of rationing and shortages. They remembered the quiet shade of the trees, the stillness of the moment, and the calm way the guards had watched over them. They remembered how their fear had slowly drained away as they realized nothing bad was coming. Some boys found themselves wondering what life might look like after the war. They had never allowed themselves to think that far ahead before. The final months of fighting had felt like a constant rush of panic, and surrender had felt like the end of everything. Now, with their wounds healing and their days passing in relative stability, the idea of a future, any future, didn't feel impossible. It felt distant, but real. The ice cream outing had been a small event, brief and simple, but it had shifted their view of the world. It showed them that kindness could appear in unexpected places. It reminded them that not every moment in captivity had to be defined by fear, and it gave them a memory strong enough to push back against the darkest thoughts that used to fill their minds. Even if they never understood exactly why the Americans chose to do it, the boys knew one thing clearly: it had changed them.